I want to tell you something before I start. I am 52 years old. I have lived a completely ordinary life in a completely ordinary way. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, went to state college, worked 30 years in railroad operations management, got married, raised 2 kids, coached Little League for 8 years, drove a Ford pickup until it had 200,000 miles on it, and then drove another one. I do not believe in ghosts. I did not believe in ghosts before what I am about to tell you happened. And in a fundamental sense, I still do not believe in ghosts, because what I experienced does not fit my definition of what a ghost is supposed to be. A ghost is supposed to be frightening, threatening, a remnant of death reaching toward the living with malicious or tortured intent. What I experienced was none of those things. What I experienced was a man doing his job. His job ended in 1961. His body ended in 1961. But his job, the actual work of it, the habit of it, the deep-grooved practice of a man who had done the same thing for 30 years, until it was more reflex than thought. His job was still going. At the house I bought in 2019, in the way that the deepest things sometimes keep going after the person who held them is gone. I need to tell you this story. I have needed to tell it for 4 years. I have told it to my wife and to one colleague who works in railroad history and to nobody else, until now. Here it is. My name is Dennis Carver. I live in a small borough in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, about 40 miles south of Pittsburgh. I have worked in railroad operations management for the Norfolk Southern Railroad system for most of my career, which means I understand rail infrastructure, rail history, and the particular culture of railroad work in ways that most people don't. This background matters for what I'm about to tell you, and not just because the house I bought in 2019 had a connection to the railroad. It matters because the specific nature of the work that I believe is still being done in that house, work that ended 62 years ago, is work I understand technically and professionally in a way that most people who might encounter it would not. I understood what I was seeing when I saw it. That made it harder, not easier. In the summer of 2019, my wife Corinne and I bought a house in a small, unincorporated community about 6 miles east of Connellsville, Pennsylvania. We had been looking for a property with some land. We'd raised our kids in a suburban neighborhood and were ready for something different. And this property appeared on the market in March of that year. 3 acres of mostly wooded land, a 2-story frame house built in 1924, a detached garage, and what the listing described as an outbuilding. The price was well below comparable properties in the area, which we attributed to the remote location and the age of the house. The house needed work, not dramatic structural work, but the accumulation of deferred maintenance that a house develops when it's been occupied by people without the means or energy to keep up with everything. The previous owner, a woman in her 80s named Margaret Hopper, had lived there for over 50 years. She had died in the house the previous October. The estate had listed it as quickly as they could manage, and we were the first serious buyers. I asked about the history of the property. The real estate agent was helpful but not detailed. The Hopper family had bought it in the late 1960s from a previous family, she believed, and before that she didn't know. I found out more on my own over the following months, and what I found is the foundation of this story. The house at the end of Miners Creek Road, which is what our road is called, a 1-lane blacktop that dead ends at the property, was built in 1924 by the Western Maryland Railway as a section house. If you're not familiar with railroad history, a section house is a company-owned dwelling provided to section foremen, the men responsible for maintaining a specific section of track, usually several miles of continuous rail and associated infrastructure. The section foreman lived in the section house with his family, was on call at all hours, and was responsible for the condition of his section of track at all times. In addition to the house, the Western Maryland Railway had built, on our property, the the structure listed as an outbuilding in the real estate description. It was not an outbuilding in any normal sense. It was a signal cabin. I need to explain what a signal cabin was, because this is the technical core of the story. In the era before computerized signaling systems, before the late 20th century, when railroad signaling moved to centralized control systems, individual signals along a line were operated manually from small trackside cabins called signal boxes or signal cabins. A signalman sat in this cabin on his shift and physically operated the levers and switches that controlled the signals, and in some cases, the switches that routed trains onto different tracks. This work required constant attention. A signalman on duty was in continuous communication with the stations on either side of him, tracking every train movement through his section, adjusting signals accordingly, ensuring that no two trains occupied the same section of track at the same time. It was precision work, repetitive work, work that required a specific kind of deep sustained attention, and that, in the days before automation, was the difference between a safely running railroad and a catastrophic collision. The signal cabin on our property had served a section of the Western Maryland Railway's main line, which ran approximately a quarter mile behind the house through a cut in the hillside. I could not see the tracks from the house. The trees and the terrain blocked them, but I could sometimes hear trains when the wind was right. The signal cabin on our property had been decommissioned in 1961, when the Western Maryland upgraded this section of line to a centralized control system. The cabin, no longer needed, was left standing on the property. When the railway sold the section house and land to the Hopper family in 1967, the signal cabin came with it. Margaret Hopper had used it for storage, which is how it had remained for 50 years. We moved in on a Saturday in late August. The previous owners had left the house largely empty. Margaret Hopper's children had divided the personal property and donated what they didn't want. So what we were moving in was entirely our own furniture and belongings into a house that had been cleaned and repainted and was ready for us. The first night in a new house is always strange. The sounds are wrong, not threatening, just unfamiliar, the particular acoustic signature of a different building doing what buildings do at night, which is breathe and settle and speak in their own language. I've moved 3 times in my adult life, and that first night is always the same. Lying in the unfamiliar dark, cataloging the sounds, letting my brain map the new space. The sound I heard at 2 in the morning was not the house settling. It came from outside, from the direction of the signal cabin, which was about 40 feet behind the house, accessible through the backyard. It was a mechanical sound, rhythmic, deliberate, the particular quality of metal engaging with metal, the sound of a lever being operated. I know what levers sound like. 30 years in railroad operations. I have been in enough signal cabins, old and new, to know what it sounds like when the levers in them are worked. The chunking, precise sound of a properly maintained lever being pulled from one position to another, the safety catch engaging, the mechanism completing its throw. That is what I heard from the direction of the signal cabin at 2 in the morning on my first night in this house. I lay still and I counted the sounds. 3 levers, a pause, 2 levers, a pause, 1 lever pulled and held. A pattern, not random mechanical noise, not the settling of old metal in a temperature change, a deliberate sequential pattern. I got out of bed. Karen was asleep. I didn't wake her. I put on my shoes and my jacket. August nights in western Pennsylvania can be cool, and I went out the back door and crossed the yard to the signal cabin. The cabin was padlocked. The padlock was the same one that had been there when we bought the property, an old Yale lock with a key that we had been given at closing, and that was hanging on the hook by our back door. I had not opened the cabin since we moved in. The padlock was engaged, locked. I stood outside the cabin door and I listened. Silence. No mechanical sounds from inside. No indication of any activity. Just the September night sounds, crickets, the distant sound of a train on the main line, wind in the trees. I went back inside. I went back to bed. I did not tell Corinne, because telling her that I had heard sounds from the padlocked signal cabin in the middle of the first night in our new house seemed like exactly the wrong way to start our life there. In the morning, drinking coffee on the back porch, looking at the cabin in the daylight, I told myself it had been a dream. The boundary between sleep and waking on the first night in a new place is blurry in ways that are well documented in sleep research. I had probably half-dreamed the sounds. My brain, full of all the railroad history I'd been reading about the property in the weeks before we moved in, had generated an appropriate dream for the environment. I believed this for about 3 weeks. On the 14th night in the new house, I heard it again. This time I was not half asleep. I had been lying awake for an hour already, the particular insomnia that sometimes comes with work stress. I was in the middle of a difficult project at work, a track condition assessment for a section of line in West Virginia, and my mind was refusing to quiet. I was looking at the ceiling and thinking about drainage coefficients when I heard it. The levers, 3 pause 2, pause 1 held. Exactly the same pattern as the first night. I was completely awake. I heard it clearly. I lay still and I listened to the whole sequence, which took approximately 90 seconds from start to finish. And then I got up and I did something I had not done the first night. I got the key from the hook by the back door. I went to the signal cabin. I unlocked the padlock. I opened the door. The interior of the signal cabin was exactly as we had found it when we bought the property. Margaret Hopper's storage, boxes, garden equipment, a few pieces of broken furniture awaiting disposal. In the back of the cabin, half covered by a tarp, the original signaling equipment. The lever frame, which is the row of levers that operated the signals and switches, mounted on a cast iron base frame that was bolted to the cabin floor. I pulled the tarp off. The lever frame was a 6-lever set, 3 pairs, painted in the alternating red and black that indicated the sequence of signal and switch operations. They were in the normal rest position, all levers horizontal, facing forward, locked in place by the individual safety catches that prevented accidental operation. Or rather, 5 of them were. One lever, the single one at the right end of the frame, was not in the rest position. It was pulled, fully thrown to its operating position, vertical and pointing backward, the safety catch engaged in the operated position. Someone had operated that lever, recently enough that the mechanism showed no rust or stiffening in the thrown position. It had been used. I stood in that cabin with my flashlight on the lever frame, and I thought about the sequence I had heard from my bed. 3 levers, 2 levers, 1 lever pulled and held. 5 levers in sequence, then 1 held. 6 levers, the whole frame. I reached out and I pushed the final lever back to its rest position. It moved smoothly, easily, as if well maintained rather than unused for 60 years. I went back to bed. I lay there for a long time. The next morning, I drove to the Fayette County Historical Society, which is housed in a building in Uniontown, and I spent 4 hours in their archive. I was looking for the history of the signal cabin on my property. Specifically, I was looking for who had worked it. Western Maryland Railway records are held in pieces at several different repositories. The company was absorbed into the Chessie system in 1973, and its records are distributed across multiple archives. But the Fayette County Historical Society had a collection of local railroad history, including employment records from several local operations that turned out to be exactly what I needed. The signal cabin on my property, designated in railway records as MP 47.3, for milepost 47.3 on the WM main line, had been staffed continuously from 1924 to 1961 by a single man. His name was Walter Fenn. Walter Fenn had been the signalman at MP 47.3 for 37 years. He had started the day the cabin opened and worked it until the day it closed. The employment record noted that when the Western Maryland upgraded to centralized control in 1961, Walter Fenn had declined the offer of reassignment to another position and had instead retired. He had been 62 years old. The record noted that he had continued to live in the section house, our house, as a retiree, purchasing it from the railway when it was sold off following the decommissioning of the cabin. He had lived in the house until his death. The death record I found in a separate file. Walter Fenn died February 14, 1967, buried in the community cemetery 3 miles from the property. He had lived in his house, next to his decommissioned signal cabin, for 6 years after he retired. And then the Hopper family had bought the property and lived in it for 50 years, and Margaret Hopper had died there, and we had bought it. And Walter Fenn, by some mechanism I do not have technical or professional vocabulary for, had never fully stopped working the signals. I want to tell you what happened in the months after I found Walter Fenn's records, because it was not what you might expect. I expected the sounds to stop once I understood them. Understanding things has always worked for me that way. Once I know what something is and why it's happening, my anxiety about it dissipates. This is a professional habit as much as a personal one. In railroad operations, half the work of managing an unusual situation is correctly identifying what kind of situation it is. Because once you know what you're dealing with, the appropriate response becomes clear. The sounds did not stop. They continued, roughly twice a month, always in the middle of the night, always the same pattern. 3 levers, 2 levers, 1 lever pulled and held. And I began to understand something about the pattern. The lever sequence at MP 47.3 in Walter Fenn's time would have corresponded to specific train movements through his section. A specific combination of signal settings created the conditions for a specific type of train movement. A mainline train proceeding through without stopping, a slower local stopping at the passing siding, a priority express that needed clear signals all the way through. Each pattern of lever operation told a specific story about what was on the line. I looked up the WM timetables from 1961, the last year Walter Fenn worked the cabin, in the railway archive. The sequence I had been hearing, 3, 2, 1 held, was the specific lever pattern for clearing a westbound express through the section without stopping. The WM ran a westbound express on Tuesday and Thursday nights. It came through MP 47.3 at approximately 2:15 in the morning. I counted back through the nights I had heard the sounds. They had all been Tuesday or Thursday nights. Walter Fenn was still clearing the Tuesday and Thursday westbound express, 60 years after he retired. I want to tell you about the first morning I spoke to him. Not because I think you will believe that I spoke to him. I am not certain I believe it myself, even now. But because it happened, and this is a story about what happened, and so I have to tell it. It was a Thursday morning in October, about 6 weeks after I found his records. I had been awake the previous night, as I often was on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Not because the sounds woke me. I had gotten accustomed to them enough that they rarely broke through sleep, but because I was in the habit of being awake at that hour and listening for them, which is a strange thing to say but is true. I had heard the full sequence. I had gone back to sleep. I had gotten up at 6 and made coffee and taken it out to the back porch, the way I did every morning, and I had been sitting there looking at the signal cabin in the early October light when I said, out loud to nobody, "Good run last night." It was railroad talk, the standard question you ask someone who just completed a shift without incident. I said it without thinking, the way you say something when the habit of a professional culture is so deep it surfaces without intention. The morning was quiet, leaves moving in the maple at the corner of the yard, a crow somewhere in the trees, the distant sound of the main line. And then from the direction of the signal cabin, a sound. Not the levers, something else. The particular sound of a window being pushed up in an old wooden frame, the stick and release of wood swollen with age, the counterweights moving in the sash channels. One of the cabin's windows, moving up, then nothing. I sat with my coffee in both hands. I said clean sheet. Clean sheet is railroad slang for a shift that completed without incident. The window, the one that had just gone up, moved again, came back down, the weight of the sash descending with a soft thud into the sill. Once, one incident-free shift, that was the signal. I have been doing this ever since. I want to describe what our life has become with Walter Fenn in it, because I think the shape of it is the most important thing about this story. It is quiet. It is domestic. It is nothing like what you would expect if someone described to you a man cohabiting with the presence of a person who died in 1967. On Tuesday and Thursday nights, at roughly 2 in the morning, I hear the levers, always the westbound express sequence. I have not heard any other sequence in 4 years, which tells me that either the Thursday westbound was Walter Fenn's primary responsibility in his last years, or that the express is the only train still running on anything like the schedule he knew. Freight moves on those lines now, not express passenger trains, but freight has its own rhythms, and perhaps one of them corresponds closely enough to the old schedule. In the mornings after, I sometimes talk to the cabin, not long conversations, short, specific professional exchanges, good shift, clean sheet, anything to report. The window answers when it answers with the simple language of up and down, yes or no, clear or unclear. I have told Corinne. This took me 8 months. I told her on a Sunday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee each, and I told her everything in the order I've told you. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which is characteristic of Corinne, and one of the reasons I have been married to her for 23 years. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it just the nights?" I said yes, Tuesday and Thursday, 2 in the morning, occasional morning exchanges. She said, "Does it bother you?" I said no, not anymore. She said, "Does it bother him?" I stopped. I had not thought about it that way. I said, "I don't think he knows anything has changed." She nodded slowly. She looked out the kitchen window toward the cabin. She said, "That's either wonderful or terribly sad. I haven't decided which." I said I hadn't either. She said, "Well, as long as he's not bothering the neighbors." I have done more research. I feel I owe it to Walter Fenn, understanding his life. The actual man who worked this cabin for 37 years feels like the right thing to do if I am going to be his neighbor in this specific way. He was born in 1899 in Fayette County. He went to work for the Western Maryland Railway at 19. In 1918, starting as a track laborer and working his way to the signal cabin at MP 47.3 by 1924 when it opened. He married a woman named Dorothy Shields in 1923. They had 2 children, a boy named Raymond and a girl named Helen. Dorothy died in 1955. Walter worked the cabin for another 6 years after her death. Raymond moved to Ohio after the war and had his own family there. Helen married and moved to Virginia. Walter Fenn spent the last 6 years of his life in the section house, our house, alone after his retirement. His children came to visit. The railway sent a representative to his retirement party, held at the local Elks Lodge. He grew a garden. He kept bees for a time. And I believe that every Tuesday and Thursday, in those 6 years between retirement and death, he was awake at 2 in the morning. Not because he couldn't sleep, because the express was coming through. Because 37 years of clearing the line for the Tuesday-Thursday westbound express is not the kind of habit that retirement interrupts. Because Walter Fenn was, at his core, a signalman, and the line still needed clearing. And whatever he is now, whatever form the deepest habits of a working life take when the man who held them is gone, whatever that is, it still needs clearing. I want to tell you about the last thing. The thing that happened last fall that I have not told anyone, not even Corinne. I'm telling you now. It was a Thursday night in November. I was awake for the usual reasons. The project I was managing had run into difficulties that week. My mind was busy. I heard the sequence at 2 a.m. The full run. 3, 2, 1 held. I lay there and listened to it complete and then lay in the quiet after it. The particular quiet of a job well done, which is a specific quality of quiet that anyone who has done precision work will recognize. And then I heard something I had not heard before. A fourth sequence. After the express was cleared, there was a pause longer than usual, maybe 2 full minutes of silence, and then a new pattern of levers, not the westbound express sequence. Something different. 2 levers, then a long pause, then one. I know signal sequences. I have studied the MP 47.3 operating records that I found in the railway archive, the specific lever arrangements for each type of train movement through that section. The sequence I heard was not in the operating records. It was not a standard train movement signal, but I recognized it. 2 and 1. 2 and 1 is not a WM signal for train movement. 2 and 1 is the number code in railway operations shorthand of that era for a personal message, a non-operational communication, the way a signalman would indicate to the station on either side of him that a message was intended for a person rather than a train. 2 and 1 means this is for you. I got up, I put on my jacket, I went to the cabin. I stood outside the door for a moment. Then I said, "I hear you, Walter." The night was cold. My breath showed. The trees were bare. November in Pennsylvania strips everything back. I said, "I want you to know the line is still running. The territory you maintain, the section you kept freight still moves through there. Good condition. They relayed the rail in 2018. New ties put in last year. It's a good section of line." I felt slightly foolish saying this. I also felt completely certain that it needed to be said. I said, "You kept it well. 37 years, that's a good run." The window went up. Stayed up for a full minute. Then came down. I went back inside. I made myself a cup of tea, too awake to sleep, the way I am after an experience that moves me. And I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about Walter Fenn working the levers for 37 years, and about Dorothy dying in 1955, and about the 6 years he spent alone in this house after the cabin closed, still waking at 2 in the morning because the express was coming through, and about the specific quality of a life organized around a specific piece of work, and what happens to that organization when the work ends. I thought about what I would do if I retired, with 30 years of railroad operations in my hands and my head. I thought about how the deepest habits don't retire with you. I drank my tea. I went back to bed. We are still in the house. We will be in the house, I think, for the rest of our lives, barring something I cannot predict. It is a good house. The land is beautiful in a quiet, western Pennsylvania way, not dramatic, not scenic in the postcard sense, but beautiful in the way of things that are simply themselves without apology. Walter Fenn's grave is in the community cemetery 3 miles away. I have visited it. It is a plain stone, granite, with his name and the dates and the words Western Maryland Railway, 1918-1961, which was apparently the information that mattered enough to his family to put on the marker. I find that right. That is what he was. I have cleaned up the signal cabin. Not restored it. I'm not trying to make it functional again. That's not what it needs. but I have organized the storage so that the lever frame is clearly visible, properly uncovered, maintained. I oil the levers twice a year with the same petroleum-based oil that the railway would have used in his time. They move freely. They are in good condition. On Tuesday and Thursday nights, at 2 in the morning, the westbound express is cleared through MP 47.3. It has been cleared every Tuesday and Thursday night for 62 years. Walter Fenn is a good signalman. The line is clear. That's the story. A man doing his job. A ghost story that isn't frightening because the ghost isn't frightening. A presence that never left because the work never left. Because 37 years of clearing the same line for the same trains is the kind of thing that becomes part of what you are. And what you are doesn't fully stop when your body does. If this story stayed with you, if you find yourself thinking about Walter Fenn at 2 in the morning, about the levers, about the window going up and down, subscribe right now. This channel is for exactly this kind of story. The ones that scare you softly, that leave you with something you didn't have before. Hit like. Every like tells me that slow, human, real feeling ghost stories have an audience that wants them. 2 seconds of your time for a story that took 4 years for someone to be ready to tell. And leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever lived somewhere that held the habits of whoever lived there before. Tell me if you've heard sounds that had no source. Tell me if you work in an industry old enough to have its own ghosts, mining, railroading, maritime, farming, and what those ghosts do when they stay behind. Tell me about Walter Fenn if you know more than I do. Tell me if you've ever stood outside a door and said I hear you to someone who shouldn't have been able to hear anything. I'll be listening. The line is clear. See you on the next story.